In 1897, the city of Wilmington, North Carolina, employed 10 black police officers out of a force of 26. It seated 3 black aldermen on its board of 10, its customs collector at the port, a federal appointment that paid more than the governor's salary, was a black man named John C. Dancy, and its most widely read daily newspaper, the Daily Record, was owned and edited by a 29-year-old black man named Alexander Manley, whose white grandfather had been the governor of North Carolina. 1 year later, every one of those men was gone. Some fled. Some were marched to the train station at gunpoint and told never to return. Some simply disappeared. The city they left behind would never be the same, and yet the building where it all unraveled, a theater and city hall at the corner of 3rd and Chestnut, still stands, still hosts performances, still holds meetings. It's called Thalian Hall. It was the most important room in the most progressive city in the American South, and then it became the room where that progress was murdered. To understand how that happened, you have to understand what Wilmington was, what it had built, what it had become, and what made powerful men decide it had to be destroyed. Wilmington sits on the Cape Fear River, about 10 miles inland from the Atlantic, in the southeastern corner of North Carolina. It was incorporated in 1739 or 1740, depending on the source, named after Spencer Compton, the Earl of Wilmington, who was the patron of the colony's governor. For most of its early life, it was a modest port town. Rice, naval stores, timber moving downriver to the ocean and out to the world. But the thing that transformed Wilmington from a coastal settlement into North Carolina's most important city was a railroad. In 1833, the North Carolina General Assembly chartered a railroad from Wilmington north to Raleigh. The citizens of Raleigh were slow to support the project, so the builders rerouted the line to Weldon, near the Virginia border, where they could connect to Virginia rail lines and tap the agricultural wealth of the Roanoke River Valley. Construction began in 1836 under the leadership of Edward B. Dudley, the railroad's first president. On March 7, 1840, the last spike was driven. The Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, 161.5 miles of track, was the longest railroad in the world. Church bells rang across the city. Cannons were fired. A parade marched down Front Street to a banquet at the depot. The whole city understood what they had, not just a railroad, but a claim to significance. The longest railroad on earth began here, at the edge of the Cape Fear River, in a town of fewer than 5,000 people. That railroad made Wilmington. The state owned 40% of the stock and subsidized maintenance until the line turned profitable after 1850. By 1860, the Wilmington and Weldon was earning a 15.5% profit on its capital stock, and the city's population had swelled to nearly 10,000, making it the largest city in North Carolina, a distinction it would hold for the next half-century, right up until about 1910. Cotton, rice, peanuts, and naval stores poured through its port. The Wilmington and Manchester Railroad connected the city to South Carolina. The Wilmington, Charlotte, and Rutherford extended its reach deep into the western mountains. The Wilmington and Weldon itself became known during the Civil War that was coming as the lifeline of the Confederacy. It was the rail line that carried supplies from the port to Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia. Wilmington was becoming what every ambitious American city dreamed of becoming. A hub, a place where goods changed hands, where money collected, where people came because the infrastructure demanded it. Then the Civil War came, and oddly enough, it made Wilmington richer. When the Union blockaded the Confederate coast, the so-called Anaconda Plan, choking off Southern trade, one Southern port after another fell silent. Norfolk fell in 1862. Savannah, Charleston, Mobile, all were effectively shut down, but Wilmington held. Its geography helped. The Cape Fear River splits into 2 channels near the coast, creating a maze of shallows and sandbars that were treacherous for the deep-draft Union warships. And Fort Fisher at the river's mouth, one of the largest earthwork fortifications ever built, kept the blockade at bay until January 1865. A Confederate officer stationed in Wilmington later wrote that after the Confederate capital in Richmond, there was not a more important place in the South than Wilmington, North Carolina. Blockade runners turned the port into one of the most lucrative trading posts in the Western Hemisphere. Cotton went out to Nassau and Bermuda at enormously inflated wartime prices. Munitions, food, medicine, and luxury goods came back. Fortunes were made overnight. Men who had been modest merchants before the war became wealthy speculators during it. The war that devastated most of the South pumped cash into Wilmington. During those years, Thalian Hall, that theater and city hall that John Montague Trimble had designed, and the city had opened with a gala on October 12, 1858, with seating for 1,000 people, a full 10% of the town's population, was in almost constant use. Over 530 performances took place between 1863 and 1864 alone. John T. Ford, the owner of Ford's Theater in Washington, where Lincoln was shot, would later lease Thalian Hall and rename it the Opera House. Even in wartime, or perhaps especially in wartime, people wanted somewhere grand to go. When the war ended and Fort Fisher fell, Wilmington's Confederate economy collapsed. But what replaced it over the next 3 decades was something far more remarkable than cotton profits. Wilmington became, slowly and almost uniquely in the American South, a city where black citizens built real economic and political power. The reason was partly demographic. Wilmington had always had a large black population. Enslaved people had worked the wharves, the turpentine distilleries, the rice plantations of the lower Cape Fear. After emancipation, many stayed. By the 1890s, the city's population was roughly 20,000, and 56% of those residents were black. To put that in perspective, New Orleans was 27% black at the time. Louisville was 17%. No city of comparable size in the South had anything like Wilmington's ratio. But numbers alone don't explain what happened. What made Wilmington unusual was what those numbers produced: a black middle class of genuine depth and ambition. Black Wilmingtonians worked as brick masons, blacksmiths, carpenters, stevedores on the docks. They ran restaurants, tailoring shops, shoemaking operations, furniture shops, and jewelry stores. Black men held higher rates of literacy than white men in Wilmington, a fact that infuriated the Democratic establishment. There was a professional class: doctors, lawyers, teachers, some of them college-educated, some with connections that stretched beyond North Carolina to Hampton, to Philadelphia, to Washington. At the city market downtown, a rare thing happened. Black and white vendors sold goods side by side, in the same stalls, to the same customers. Frederick Sadgwar, a black carpenter and contractor, was one of the most prominent builders in the city. He lived, as it happened, next door to Hugh McRae, the president of the Wilmington Cotton Mills Company. We'll come back to that. The economic engine driving all of this was cotton. The firm of Alexander Sprunt and Son, founded in 1866 by a Scottish immigrant, had grown by the 1890s into what was likely the largest cotton exporting house in the United States. The Sprunt Cotton Compress down on the waterfront employed hundreds of workers, many of them black, processing and loading bales for shipment to more than 50 agencies across England, France, Germany, Russia, and beyond. At peak season, the compress handled upwards of 225,000 bales a year. Port tonnage was climbing steadily. James Sprunt, who had run blockade as a teenager during the Civil War and had used sugar profits to buy his first cotton, had become one of Wilmington's wealthiest and most respected citizens. He also served as the British vice consul. Cotton was king, the port was booming, and the money flowed through a city where black and white citizens, in their imperfect and unequal way, shared the same streets and sometimes the same ambitions. Then came the political earthquake. In the early 1890s, a severe recession hit North Carolina's farmers hard. White farmers, angry that the Democratic Party had sided with railroads and banks over working people, turned to the Populist Party. The Populists, despite holding many of the same racial views as the Democrats, realized they could gain power by joining forces with black Republicans. This alliance, improbable, fragile, driven more by economic desperation than by any deep commitment to racial equality, was called fusion. And it worked. In 1894, the fusionist coalition swept the North Carolina General Assembly. In 1896, they elected a Republican governor, Daniel Russell, the first Republican to hold that office since Reconstruction. They also sent George Henry White, a black man, to the United States Congress. In Wilmington, the effects were immediate and visible. Under fusionist reforms, positions that had been appointed by the Democratic-controlled state legislature were converted to elected offices, which meant black candidates could actually run, and they did. By 1897, the city had a fusionist mayor, Silas P. Wright, who was white. It had a biracial board of aldermen, 4 black members out of 10. It had those 10 black police officers, the black city treasurer, the black city jailer, the black city coroner, and 40 black magistrates throughout the city and county. John C. Dancy collected customs at the port, a position that put him in charge of every ship that entered or left the Cape Fear River. Magistrates, mail carriers, deputy clerks of court, deputy sheriffs, street superintendents, black men held positions up and down the civic structure. For the first time in the history of any southern city of any size, black men shared genuine governing power with whites. This is the Wilmington that people mean when they call it the most progressive city in the South. It wasn't a utopia. Black and white Wilmingtonians were socially segregated in many ways. Economic inequality was real and deep. But the political structure, the visible, everyday machinery of government, was biracial in a way that existed nowhere else, and it was growing. The Daily Record, Alexander Manly's newspaper, operated out of Love and Charity Hall on 7th Street. A monthly subscription cost 25 cents. Individual copies were 2 cents. It was, as far as historians can determine, the only black-owned daily newspaper in the United States. Manly used it to write about black empowerment, economic development, and the civic life of a community that was, for the first time, participating fully in its own governance. Now, all of this, the black aldermen, the black police officers, the black customs collector earning more than the governor, was happening in a state where the Democratic Party had controlled politics for decades and considered black political participation an existential threat, and a few men decided to end it. The conspiracy to destroy Wilmington's biracial government was not spontaneous. It was not a riot that spiraled out of control. It was a plan, drawn up in private, executed in public, and celebrated afterward. 3 men above all engineered it. Furnifold Simmons was the chairman of the North Carolina Democratic Party, an organizational genius who understood campaigns the way a general understands terrain. Josephus Daniels was the publisher of the Raleigh News and Observer, the most influential newspaper in the state. He would later call his paper the militant voice of white supremacy, and he wasn't being modest. Charles B. Aycock was a lawyer and political aspirant who wanted to be governor and saw white supremacy as his path to the mansion. Together, they designed what they openly called the White Supremacy Campaign of 1898. The strategy had 3 prongs, which Daniels himself would later describe with admiration: men who could write, men who could speak, and men who could ride. The writers generated propaganda. For months before the November 1898 election, the News and Observer ran a relentless stream of fabricated stories about black criminality, black corruption, and black sexual violence against white women. Because roughly 20% of white North Carolinians were illiterate, much of the campaign was carried out through political cartoons. Grotesque, racist caricatures depicting black men as dim-witted beasts and black office holders as corrupt buffoons. The speakers, Aycock was the finest of them, and he toured the state tirelessly, delivered fiery addresses at rallies that drew thousands. On October 20th, 1898, the Democrats staged their largest rally in Fayetteville, where 300 red shirts paraded alongside 22 young white women in a procession punctuated by cannon fire and a brass band. A guest of honor was South Carolina Senator Ben Tillman, who berated the white men of North Carolina for not yet killing that damn nigger editor, meaning Manly, and bragged that if the editorial had been published in South Carolina, Manly would already be dead. And the riders were the red shirts themselves. Bands of heavily armed white men imported from South Carolina's model of political terrorism, who rode through black neighborhoods on horseback, firing guns, threatening voters, and making clear that anyone who showed up at the polls would answer for it. In Wilmington itself, the local conspiracy was led by a group of 9 prominent white businessmen who called themselves, with no apparent sense of irony, the Secret Nine. Their leader was Hugh McRae, the cotton mill president, Frederick Sadgeworth's next-door neighbor. McRae and the other 8 met at his home and decided that the situation in Wilmington required direct action. They drafted a document. They called it the White Declaration of Independence. Think about that name for a moment. These men understood perfectly well what they were doing. They were not framing their actions as a response to a crisis. They were framing them as a founding, a new beginning, a revolution in the original sense, a restoration of what they considered the natural order. The document called for the removal of black voting rights and the overthrow of the biracial government. It did not mince words. Meanwhile, Alexander Manly gave them a weapon, though whether he handed it over or they simply seized it is a matter of interpretation. In August 1897, a white Georgia woman named Rebecca Latimer Felton had given a speech urging white men to lynch black men by the thousands, if necessary, to protect white women from what she called an epidemic of rape. The speech circulated through Southern newspapers for a year. On August 18, 1898, Manly responded with an editorial in the Daily Record that challenged the entire premise. He argued that black men were not rapists, that many relationships between black men and white women were consensual, and that white men had been debauching black women for generations. He wrote, in a line that would be quoted and requoted for months, that white men should not expect their women to remain pure while they were debauching black women. It was an editorial that said what many people knew and no one was supposed to say. It was also, in the atmosphere of 1898, a match thrown into a barrel of gunpowder. But Simmons, the strategist, recognized the editorial's value. He instructed the white leadership in Wilmington to suppress their rage, not because the rage was wrong in his view, but because the timing was wrong. August was too early. He wanted the outrage to peak near Election Day. So the Democratic newspapers reprinted Manly's editorial over and over across the state through the fall, stoking fury at a controlled burn. By October, Wilmington was a city on a knife's edge. On October 24, 1898, 50 of Wilmington's most prominent white men, men like Robert Glenn and Charles Aycock, packed Thalian Hall, that theater Trimble had designed, that room where Lillian Russell had performed and John Philip Sousa had played, where the Thalian Association had staged comedies since 1788. Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer and former United States congressman, a man with a polished speaking manner and a patrician bearing, took the stage. What he said was not polished. He told the crowd that white supremacy was the only issue that mattered. He told them they must rid the city of black rule. And then he said something that even the most hardened racists in the audience remembered. He said they would change things in Wilmington if they had to choke the current of the Cape Fear River with carcasses. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. On November 8, 1898, the state election took place. The red shirts had done their work. Black voters were intimidated, threatened, and in some cases physically prevented from reaching the polls. Democratic election officers tampered with returns. The Democrats swept the state legislature. But there was a problem. The Wilmington city government, the mayor, the board of aldermen, the police chief, had not been on the ballot. Those elections weren't scheduled until March 1899. The fusionist government was still legally in power. The Democrats were unwilling to wait 4 months. The morning of November 9th, the day after the election, Hugh McCrae had the Wilmington Messenger call for a mass meeting. The paper published a notice, "Attention white men." All white men were to report to the courthouse the next morning for important business. 600 men packed the building. McCrae sat in front with former Mayor S.H. Fishblate and other prominent Democrats. When Waddell arrived, McCrae handed him the White Declaration of Independence. Waddell read it to the crowd, proclaiming what it called the supremacy of the white man. The crowd roared approval. A committee of 25 was appointed to carry out the resolutions. Waddell was made its chair. That evening, the committee drafted a list of demands for Wilmington's black community. The Daily Record must be shut down. Alexander Manly must leave the city. A delegation of black leaders was given until 7:30 the next morning to respond. The black leaders met and drafted a conciliatory reply, agreeing to most of the demands. But the letter was sent by mail. A black lawyer named Armand Scott attempted to deliver it by hand, but was turned back by white patrols roaming the streets. The letter did not arrive by the deadline. Waddell declared that the black community had refused to comply. The morning of November 10, 1898, was cool and gray. At around 8 o'clock, Waddell assembled a column of men at the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory on Market Street. They numbered somewhere around 500 at the start, though the column grew as it moved through the city. They marched east on Market, then turned south on 7th Street. At the end of the march stood Love and Charity Hall, the two-story building where the Daily Record had its offices and press. It was also an African-American community center, a place where societies met and events were held. The men entered the building. They ransacked it. Then they set it on fire. Alexander Manley was already gone. He had fled the city sometime before dawn, warned by people who understood what was coming. He would never return to Wilmington. He eventually settled in Philadelphia, where he worked as a painter and later in real estate. He died in 1944 at the age of 78, having never set foot in the city where he once published the only black daily newspaper in America. Only 7 copies of the Daily Record have ever been recovered. As Love and Charity Hall burned, the fire bells rang across Wilmington. A black fire crew responded, but they were held back by the mob at Castle and 5th Streets until the building was beyond saving. Only then were the firefighters allowed to douse the flames. The fire bells had a second effect. They were a signal, whether intentional or not, that the violence had begun. Throughout the black neighborhoods of Wilmington's north side, women and children heard the bells and fled. Some ran north toward Pine Forest Cemetery. Others hid in the swamps outside the city. Others made for Oakdale Cemetery, the white burial ground, on the theory that no one would look for them among the graves. Within hours, what had been a targeted action against a newspaper became a broader massacre. The tinderbox ignited at the corner of 4th and Harnett Streets, where black men at Walker's grocery store faced off against white men gathered at Brunje's saloon across the street. A shot was fired. Someone yelled that a white man had been killed. Gunfire erupted. Unarmed black men scattered in all directions and were shot as they ran. Now the Wilmington Light Infantry, the white government union, and the red shirts poured into the black neighborhoods. They carried rifles, revolvers, and a Gatling gun, the rapid-fire weapon that was the forerunner of the modern machine gun. Crews of militiamen aimed the Gatling gun at black churches, homes, and gathering places. At St. Stephen's AME Church, the largest black congregation in the city, a Wilmington Light Infantry crew pointed the gun at the front door and demanded entry, claiming the church was being used as an arsenal. The ministers opened the church. No weapons were found. All day, the killing continued. Wilmington Light Infantry soldiers shot African Americans near the 4th Street Bridge. Armed patrols roamed the streets. An exact death toll has never been established, and the uncertainty itself is part of the story. It speaks to what was valued and what was not, whose death was recorded and whose was not. The coroner's official count was 14. A 2006 report commissioned by the state of North Carolina settled on as many as 60. Some black Wilmingtonians believed the real number was over 300. All of the known dead were black. While the shooting was still going on, the political coup proceeded on schedule. Waddell and George Roundtree, another prominent Democrat, went to City Hall. The other half of Thalian Hall, remember, the same building where Waddell had given his speech, and demanded that the mayor and board of aldermen resign. One by one, they did. Each outgoing member was replaced by a man handpicked by the conspirators. Mayor Silas Wright resigned last. The board then elected Alfred Moore Waddell as the new mayor of Wilmington. Let the mechanics of that sink in. The conspirators did not seize power by declaring martial law or suspending the government. They forced the sitting officials to resign, installed replacements, and then held a vote among men they themselves had chosen, to legitimize the result. The form of democracy was maintained even as its substance was obliterated. In the days that followed, the new government moved to make the revolution permanent. Prominent black citizens and white fusionist allies were rounded up, jailed briefly for their own safety, and then marched to the train station under military escort and ordered to leave Wilmington. A list of about 30 names had been prepared in advance. None of them, according to historian David Zucchino's research, ever returned. Black property owners who stayed faced a different kind of pressure. The new government made clear that economic retaliation would follow any resistance. Some sold their property and left. Others stayed and endured what came next. There was a scene at the Sprunt Cotton Compress that day that captures something essential about what was happening, about who had power and what they used it for. When the shooting began, rumors spread that the 800 black laborers at the compress were arming themselves and preparing to march into the city and fight back. It was not true, but truth was beside the point. The mob wheeled one of the Gatling guns down to the waterfront and aimed it at the compress. James Sprunt, the Cotton King, the British vice consul, one of the richest men in the city, was terrified, not because he feared for his own life, but because those 800 men were his entire labor force. Ships were waiting at the docks. Cotton bales were stacked in the warehouse. The compress operated on seasonal urgency. If the laborers were killed or scattered, his shipments would halt. His contracts would collapse. Sprunt asked his black workers to lift him up onto a bale of uncompressed cotton. They hoisted this small, wiry Scotsman onto the bale, and from that makeshift platform he addressed the armed white crowd, trying to calm both sides, trying to save his business. The standoff ended without bloodshed. The Gatling gun was wheeled away. The men went back to work. The cotton was loaded. The ships sailed. The economic machinery of Wilmington continued to function. It was only the political machinery, the part where black men had a say, that had been destroyed. No one was ever charged for the murders of November 10th. No one was arrested for the arson. No one was prosecuted for the overthrow of a legally elected government. President William McKinley, a Republican who owed the party's existence in the South to black voters, refused to intervene. He claimed he could not act without a request from the governor. Governor Daniel Russell, the fusionist Republican who had been elected with black support, was paralyzed with fear. On the day of the coup, he had been traveling by train and was warned by allies that he himself might be seized. He made no request. The federal government did nothing. The lesson was unmistakable. The white supremacists had succeeded, and no one, not the state, not the president, not the courts, would stop them. The men who planned and executed the coup were rewarded, every one of them. Alfred Moore Waddell served as mayor of Wilmington until 1905 and was remembered by the city's white establishment as a civic leader. Hugh McRae became a city alderman and went on to accumulate vast holdings, banks, real estate, shopping developments. His family donated land for a public park, deeded specifically to the white citizens of Wilmington. Furnifold Simmons was elected to the United States Senate in 1900 and served for 30 years. Charles Aycock became governor of North Carolina in 1901. For generations, he was celebrated as the education governor for building over 1,000 schools, though the education he championed was strictly segregated, and the political order he helped create systematically excluded black citizens from public life. Josephus Daniels continued to publish the News and Observer, was later appointed Secretary of the Navy by Woodrow Wilson, and for decades was memorialized with a bust in the lobby of the newspaper he had used as a weapon. It was only in the 21st century that the Daniels family removed his statue from outside the building. George Henry White, the black congressman from North Carolina, served until 1901. He was the last black representative from North Carolina for 91 years. The next would be Eva Clayton, elected in 1992. The new Democratic legislature wasted no time. It enacted North Carolina's first Jim Crow laws mandating the separation of races in train passenger cars. In 1900, a constitutional amendment disenfranchised black voters through literacy tests, poll taxes, and a grandfather clause. You could vote without passing a literacy test only if your grandfather had been eligible to vote before 1867, a provision that effectively excluded every descendant of enslaved people. Most fusionist policies were reversed. County governments were placed back under centralized state control. The Democrats controlled local and state government for the next 70 years, and Wilmington changed. The numbers tell the story with brutal precision. Before the coup, Wilmington was 56% black. By the 1900 census, taken less than 2 years after the massacre, it was 49%. In 1910, it was 47%. In 1930, 40%. In 1950, 35%. In 1990, 33%. By 2018, the black population of Wilmington was 18.3%. What had been a majority black city, a city where black citizens had built businesses and held office and published a newspaper and walked a beat as police officers, became, over the course of a century, a city where black residents were a small and politically marginal minority. The outmigration that began in the terrified nights of November 1898 never really stopped. It just became quieter. The economic trajectory of Wilmington after 1898 is its own kind of story. The Atlantic Coastline Railroad, formed in 1900 from the merger of the Wilmington and Weldon and over 100 other rail companies, established its headquarters in Wilmington. For 60 years, the railroad was the city's dominant employer, operating more than 5,000 miles of track across 6 states. It was a Class I railroad, meaning it generated over $250 million annually. The headquarters sat on Red Cross Street downtown, a few blocks from Thalian Hall, a few blocks from the Cotton Exchange, a few blocks from the docks where Sprunt's cotton still shipped. Wilmington remained a functioning city, a port city, a railroad city. But it was now a different kind of city, one where the black community had been stripped of its political voice, where the memory of what had happened was deliberately suppressed, and where the white power structure that had engineered the coup held unchallenged authority. In 1960, the Atlantic Coastline moved its headquarters to Jacksonville, Florida, chasing the growth of its Florida operations and the lure of a newer, more modern city. That single decision, a corporate relocation, the kind of thing that happens in American cities all the time, hollowed out Wilmington's economy in a way that the coup never had. The railroad had been the city's anchor employer for 60 years. When it left, it took not just jobs, but identity. By the 1970s, the downtown was deteriorating. Buildings that had been full when cotton was king and the railroad ran, everything stood vacant. The old Cotton Exchange buildings on Front Street, once the nerve center of one of the world's largest cotton exporting operations, were mostly empty. Alexander Sprunt and Son, which had been the largest cotton exporter in the country, had dissolved in 1950. The Cotton Exchange Complex, the Sprunt Building, the Boney and Harper Mill, the old Don Hart Saloon, the wholesale grocer, was eventually renovated into a shopping complex in the late 1970s, the kind of adaptive reuse that signals a city grasping for a second act. You can trace a straight line from the cotton bale to the scented candle. And the history of November 10, 1898, was buried. For decades, the event was referred to in textbooks and civic memory as a race riot. The implication being that black citizens had started it, that white citizens had been defending themselves. The Wilmington Morning Star and other newspapers had reported it that way at the time, and the lie calcified into accepted history. Generations of Wilmington schoolchildren, black and white, either never learned what happened or learned a distorted version of it. The state's textbooks, overseen by the same Democratic establishment that had benefited from the coup, ensured that the white mythology of 1898 hardened like lacquer with each passing decade. It was not until the 1950s that scholars began to call the event a massacre rather than a riot. Not until the 1990s, as the centennial approached, that Wilmington itself began to reckon with its history. In 1998, Governor Jim Hunt appointed the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot Commission, note that they still use the word riot in the commission's name, to investigate what had happened. The commission worked for 8 years. In 2006, it published its report, which concluded that the events of November 10, 1898, constituted a coup d'etat and a massacre, that as many as 60 black citizens were killed, that more than 2,000 were displaced, and that the perpetrators were never held accountable. The commission recommended, among other things, that the state acknowledge the injustice, incorporate the history into school curricula, and explore reparative measures for the economic damage done to the black community. In 2008, a memorial park was dedicated at 1081 North 3rd Street in Wilmington. It consists of 6 bronze paddles, each 16 feet tall, arranged in an arc on a stone circle. The paddles symbolize the role of water in the spiritual beliefs of people from the African continent, a passage from the world of the living to the world of the dead. A bronze wall in front of the paddles is inscribed with a description of the events. At the site where Love and Charity Hall once stood, where the Daily Record was printed and then burned, you can, if you kick around in the dirt for a few minutes, still find bricks from the foundation. There is a particular detail about the aftermath of the coup that deserves attention because it reveals the mechanism by which a single day of violence can reshape a city for a century. When the new white government took power, it didn't just replace officials, it replaced the rules. The city election scheduled for March 1899 proceeded without Republican opposition. The new legislature enacted election laws designed to prevent black political participation, and the economic effects compounded. Black property owners who had been banished lost their homes and businesses. Those who stayed found their economic options narrowing as white-controlled institutions systematically excluded them. The number of black grocers in Wilmington actually increased fourfold between 1895 and 1915, suggesting resilience and adaptation. But the professional class, the doctors, lawyers, and politicians who had made Wilmington unusual, was gone. The city still had black residents. It no longer had black power. Hugh McRae's family, meanwhile, expanded their holdings for generations. As late as 1998, the McRae name was on parks, shopping centers, and banks. Hugh McRae II, one of the most powerful men in Wilmington in the 1990s, told a Christian Science Monitor reporter that his grandfather did not support the violence of 1898 and that no apology was necessary. "History has shown people will defend their territory," he said, seated in his office. The Cotton Exchange on Front Street is a shopping complex now. You can buy candles and local art where cotton bales once were compressed and loaded onto ships bound for Liverpool. Thalian Hall, beautifully restored, hosts nearly 700 events a year. It has been designated a National Historic Landmark. The ornate proscenium arch, installed in 1909, frames performances by local theater companies and touring artists. The Condé Nast Traveler named it one of the best theaters in America. Visitors admire the classical revival facade and the late Victorian interior. A marker outside notes its construction dates, its architect, its historical significance. It does not mention Alfred Moore Waddell's speech or the crowd of over 1,000 that cheered when he promised to fill the Cape Fear River with bodies. The story of Wilmington in 1898 is sometimes called the only successful coup d'etat in American history. That distinction carries weight, but it also risks turning the event into a curiosity, a one-off, an aberration, something that happened once and could not happen again. What makes it more than a curiosity is the machinery. The coup required a newspaper willing to print lies. It required businessmen willing to fund and organize political violence. It required paramilitaries willing to carry it out. It required elected officials willing to look the other way. It required a federal government willing to do nothing. All of those elements were present in Wilmington in 1898. The men who built that machinery were not outcasts or radicals. They were the wealthiest, most respected citizens in the city. The cotton mill president, the newspaper editor, the party chairman, the former congressman. They planned the coup in a living room. They announced it in the city's finest theater. They executed it in daylight, and then they governed. What was lost on November 10, 1898, was not just a set of office holders or a newspaper or a neighborhood. What was lost was the proof that it could work, that a southern city could function with black men in positions of authority, that a biracial government could operate, that the races could share, however imperfectly, the machinery of self-governance. Wilmington was the test case, and the men who destroyed it understood that. They were not reacting to failure, they were reacting to success. The city worked. That was the problem. Alexander Manly's grandfather, Charles Manly, had governed the entire state of North Carolina from 1849 to 1851. His grandson published a newspaper and was driven from the city by a mob. The press was burned. The building was razed. The foundation bricks sank into the dirt. They are still there, on South 7th Street, if you know where to look.